Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 26th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones and Blackberries, etc., as they do affect the broadcasting system, although having said that, some members may be consulting their tablets because they have their papers on those devices. The agenda item 1 is Procurement Reform Scotland Bill, and today we'll hear from the Cabinet Secretary as well as her supporting team of government officials on the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. This is the final evidence session on the bill before the committee considers a draft report in January. At this point, I'd like to welcome Duncan McNeill, convener of the Health and Sport Committee, who will be joining us for this evidence session. And I also welcome Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure Investment in Cities, Paul McNulty, Head of Procurement Policy and Development, Bill Watt, Bill Team Leader, and Mark Richards, Solicitor, Branch Head of Commercial and Business Services of the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Thanks, Convener. As I think we all understand, Scottish public bodies spend round about £10 billion each and every year buying things, and so the decisions they make when they're spending that money are of enormous importance to businesses, the third sector and, of course, to the economy as a whole. Our approach to procurement in recent years has seen us make significant progress, but I also think most people accept that there's still room for improvement in the way the public sector buys goods, works and services. It's important that we strive to strike the right balance between being business-friendly on the one hand and addressing social and environmental needs and aspirations on the other hand. In the bill, we seek to be business-friendly by standardising processes, streamlining bureaucracy and encouraging innovation, and we seek to be socially responsible by looking at the broader economic implications of procurement decisions. Making sure we build in considerations like community and environmental benefits at the start of the process and not as last-minute add-ons is also very important, as is setting clear standards for the conduct of public procurement and making clear the importance of good business ethics. So the bill seeks to establish a national legislative framework for public procurement that is both business-friendly and socially responsible. I think it's also important to stress that it's not sitting in isolation. It's part of the bigger programme of reform that we embarked on in Scotland after the publication of John McClelland's report in 2006. That programme has led to the development of what is increasingly referred to as a Scottish model of procurement, which seeks to maximise the contribution that procurement can make to our economic prosperity. Sees procurement very much as an integral part of policy development and service delivery, looking to use the power of public spend to deliver genuine public value in purchasing. The value for money triangle, cost, quality and sustainability is central to the Scottish model of procurement, and economic, social and environmental sustainability must be at the heart of what we do. The bill will place a small number of general duties on public bodies regarding their procurement activities, for example, to act without discrimination and in a transparent and proportionate manner, and in a way that is best designed to improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the area in which they operate. It also provides for specific measures aimed at promoting good practice in procurement. I've heard a lot of discussion, as the committee will have heard, about the types of issues that the bill should address and how it should address these issues. You'll no doubt recognise the strength and depth of feeling on various aspects of the bill from differing stakeholder groups. Striking an appropriate balance when dealing with views which are in some cases in this area of policy diametrically opposed has not been without challenges, but taken together I think the package of measures within the bill strikes an appropriate balance in responding to those views while retaining the flexibility to cover the diverse range of goods, services and works that are procured by our very diverse public sector. Importantly, the bill, I think, is flexible enough to support the wide range of policy and service delivery for which the public sector in Scotland is responsible. Also, we recognise that in the case of some types of contract, for example, health and social care contracts, or contracts where universities and colleges need to award in support of research and teaching commissions, special circumstances apply. And in both of these areas, we are committed to addressing the concerns that have been highlighted in evidence before the committee. So to conclude, Convener, we believe that making procurement spending work better for Scotland has enormous potential to contribute to our economic, social and environmental well-being, and it can help to ensure that Scotland remains at the vanguard of innovative public procurement, enabling the best outcomes for Scotland. So I think the bill helps to work towards those goals, but I'm very keen to hear the committee's views as part of the ongoing scrutiny process of the bill.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark, would you like to start off the question?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to touch on some of the closing points you made there around tendering for care and support services. A lot of the evidence that we've received have thrown up problems with tendering for those services being driven on the basis of cost rather than quality, and really driving down paying conditions of workers, causing a high degree of turnover within some of the companies that are providing those services, and also round about an obligation on a public authority to re-tender for work at the end of a contract, which then creates issues at the point of delivery where there's a break in continuity where a particular person could be used to a particular provider, and that staff and the need for that authority to re-tender. What's your view of the opinion that's been expressed by some in the third sector that care and support services should be exempt from that competitive tendering?
I've listened carefully to that evidence and read a lot of the evidence, and I've got a great degree of sympathy with it. Clearly, I come with a background of being Health Secretary, so I know from first-hand experience how some of these issues can arise. I should say, before I answer the question directly, I should say for the record, and I kind of hinted at this in my opening remarks, cost should never be the sole factor in making these decisions. I spoke about the sort of triangle, the cost triangle, where cost, quality and sustainability have to operate in concert, and I think it's always important that we bear that in mind. In terms of the specifics of your question, I am very aware that there are special issues. There are special issues in these areas, which mean that it would not be appropriate to require competitive tendering for health and social care contracts. I should say that where an authority does choose to hold a competition for these kinds of services, it is important that some provisions in the bill would continue to apply. It's also important, I think, that an authority's procurement strategy, and we might come on to talk about procurement strategies in more detail, and their contracts register cover health and social care contracts, but I can sort of make clear today, having listened to the evidence, that it is our intention to bring forward an amendment to the bill at stage 2, which will exempt health and social care contracts from the provisions in the bill which relate to advertising and competition, and I hope that will go some way to addressing the concerns that have been raised. But of course I'll listen and pay close attention to the committee's report and determining whether there's further steps we can make as the bill progresses to address these concerns.
Okay, Duncan, did you want to?
Similarly, coming from the focus that we've had, and I've had, and the Health Committee have had on this, I think that is, from the Cabinet Secretary, a welcome position that stops that merry-go-round and puts a lot of pressure on the third sector in regard to that. I presume, shouldn't presume, that is a recognition. The question I was going to ask is that does the Scottish Government agree that the procurement and commissioning process in itself can and has had a negative impact, despite a negative impact on the outcomes for people in terms of who are in receipt of social care, despite the objective that you pointed out earlier, that there are genuine attempts to balance good value with good quality. Unfortunately, it's not always worked that way, and I think we need to confirm that the government accepts that the procurement and commissioning policy can have a negative impact on the outcomes for people in receipt of social care.
I think what I'm saying is, I've listened to and can recognise some of the concerns that have been raised, and I think our obligation is to make sure that the procurement regime, for example, doesn't lead to those undesirable outcomes. And while I think we would all accept that where public authority is procuring, I don't know, to take a random example, stationery, paper clips, whatever, then, or at a much higher level, building new facilities, then it's absolutely crucial that these rules that are laid down in this bill, and also for higher value contracts in the EU, rules are applied. And where an authority chooses to go out to competition for a health or a social care contract because they think that's the right approach, these rules around transparency, non-discrimination, etc. should apply. I think the issue comes around the mandating of that competition, which is why the amendment I've spoken about that would make clear that health and social care contracts are exempt from the provisions in the bill which relate to advertising in competition is so important. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, I do recognise these concerns, and as we will do across a whole range of areas, we'll try to address them as responsibly as we can.
Has it been an objective then? I mean, obviously for that, for one indicator, I don't know if there's other areas where you'll be looking at, but is it an objective from the Scottish Government to use the procurement bill to address some of those issues that have been raised by Audit Scotland and by the Health and Sport Committee, and indeed the Local Government and the Communities Committee last time around? What other measures or amendments do you see coming forward that will address the government's policy and outcomes, and good quality outcomes for people in receipt of social care?
I think I make a few points to that. First, we've already published quite extensive guidance on procuring care contracts. I think there is a question about the extent to which that is followed in all cases, and I think there's issues there for us in terms of making sure that public bodies follow that. The second point I would make is, and as convener of the Health and Sport Committee, you'll be as aware of this as I am, of the former Health Secretary. We have, inspection regimes and quality assurance regimes across the health and social care system that should be operating to ensure that, regardless of how these services come into being, the quality that they're providing is appropriate. And I know that's something the Health and Sport Committee has previously applied a lot of scrutiny to. In terms of specifics about the bill, I've spoken about the amendment we intend to bring forward. I dare say we'll go on in the course of our discussion this morning to looking at the duty on certain authorities, if they're procuring in a year above a certain value of contracts, to publish procurement strategies, and that is designed to force upon public authorities the discipline of looking in detail at what they're trying to achieve with procurement. One of the things that looks at is consultation with relative stakeholders affected by procurement, and I think that also brings to bear some important factors in this kind of discussion. So, I've kind of said what we intend to do at stage 2. I'm not closing my mind. If the committee wants to recommend sort of further steps that we should be considering, we will consider them. But I'm being very clear and open that we recognise the concerns that have been expressed and want to respond to them and avoid any unintended consequences of this legislation in areas where we wouldn't want to see that happen.
Just a couple of specifics briefly, because there are other issues and questions coming ahead. But one of the big focuses in social care and elderly care is a 10-minute visit, highlighted by a horrible panorama programme some time ago with the e-procurement and the reverse auctions. Now, we've got lots of guidance in, but we still have at the heart of care, a very short visit that builds on a 10-minute. How will the procurement bill address issues like that, or indeed some of the continuity issues where we accept in the acute setting and from nurses that the continuity of care is very, very important. But when we get care in the community or care in a residential setting, it's less important. Now, how do we, are we expecting too much from the procurement bill to achieve some of that? Or how can we use the procurement bill to address issues like that, to improve the outcomes for people, what the Scottish Government want?
I think in recognising absolutely the concern you're raising and sharing a lot of that concern, I think we've got to be careful we're not expecting the procurement bill to deal with these kind of issues, particularly as I've just said, we're going to exempt a lot of these contracts from the provisions of the procurement bill. So I think it's why I spoke in my earlier answer to you about sort of the wider context of this. I think there are issues there that have to be addressed through some of these other routes, and I'm more than happy to write to the committee in more detail about how we do that. I think we'd be making a mistake to see the procurement legislation as the sole or even the main means of dealing with that. I think the concern that we're trying to address around the procurement legislation is that by having health and social care contracts subject to the advertising and competition provisions of the procurement bill, we might actually worsen some of these issues rather than help to make them better.
That would be helpful, Cabinet Secretary, if you were to write on those. But it's not just provisions in the bill that you rightly said that are at stake here. I mean, it's personalised payments for individuals who need care. But one of the things that we found in taking evidence from the third sector in Glasgow was that the third sector and voluntary organisations are often treated very differently in the procurement process from private companies, for example, asking for any profits made to be returned to the procurer. Surely that is not acceptable in a procurement process.
Obviously, what the bill is trying to do is, within the European rules around procurement, is to make sure that through, for example, the sustainable procurement duty, that thought is given to how the third sector, small enterprises, are able to be involved in procurement exercises. Some of the provisions around pre-qualification questionnaires, for example, and the information that can be provided is about trying to ensure that there's not disproportionate or unreasonable barriers being put in the way of these smaller enterprises. So the bill is very much focused now, as we'll get on to talk about, the bill in large parts is about giving ministers enabling powers to produce regulations and guidance around some of these things, but the import of it and the thrust of it is about trying to ensure that in terms of how procuring authorities go about their business, they are not inadvertently or advertently putting unnecessary or disproportionate barriers in the way of smaller enterprises or third sector enterprises.
Did you want to come in, Mr McNulty?
I think part of the problem is that the guidance, very detailed guidance that we've published, that includes a presumption that you should never use something like a reverse auction, which you've mentioned, for personal social care contracts, isn't always being followed, and that's one of the things that the bill is trying to help us address, that where the government does issue policy guidelines on important issues such as this, they should actually be observed by public bodies.
Yeah, so the bill is giving a statutory basis for the issuing of guidance, which, as Paul says, makes it not optional for public authorities to follow it, but mandatory. And that wouldn't just apply, I mean, we'll get on to discussing some of these other issues later on, wouldn't just apply to what you're talking about in terms of social care contracts, but would apply to other aspects of the behaviour of organisations bidding for public sector contracts.
Mark, would you like to continue?
Yeah, we've heard as a committee that some of the areas in the bill could have been introduced without legislation. I wonder if you could outline why the government has chosen to introduce a bill.
I think we've probably just kind of hit on one of the reasons for that in our last discussion there, that we have issued guidance. There has been an issue about whether that guidance is always followed. So this bill is given statutory underpinning to guidance that the government will issue, so public authorities will have to have regard to that. I also know from feedback I get that there has been a sense that quite large value public contracts, but large value public contracts that are not as high value as to see the EU thresholds kick in are completely unregulated legislatively, so this fills that gap. The bill is also, to a large extent about trying to embed good practice and standardise good practice. We've got, pockets of very good practice, but it's not necessarily uniform across all of the public sector, and the bill tries to standardise that. Public Contracts Scotland, the portal for advertising contracts, we see the benefit of more and more contracts being advertised in that way, but without this legislation, we're not able to mandate that all contracts within the thresholds are advertised in that way. So there's a whole variety of reasons why I think it's right to give the legislative underpinning to some of the work we have been doing with good effect, but to give it that further push forward, we need to have the legislative underpinning that this bill gives us.
On the issue of the guidance that will be issued, what are your plans for for issuing that guidance, and will the committee get to see any early drafts of that guidance before conclusion of stage 1?
I'm not sure we'll be able to do that before conclusion of stage 1, but I'm happy to share with the committee at the appropriate time drafts of guidance, because I think the committee's input into that would be very useful. We will do extensive consultation with stakeholders in preparing the guidance. You'll know from your familiarity with the bill that there is a lot of enabling powers in the bill that will require to be used through regulations and guidance, and I'm very happy to give an undertaking that will fully involve the committee in that process.
Thanks for that. And on the new EU directives which are due to come into place, what is the anticipated impact of those regulations on the procurement reform bill, and are there any areas of the bill which you think may have to be amended in light of those regulations?
It's possible that that will be the case. I mean, I think the first thing I should make clear is this bill is not transposing into our law this new EU directive, nor is this bill seeking to replace the 2012 regulations that have transposed the current directive. This is in addition to European regulations by regulating contracts that are below the threshold set by the European Union. It is possible, though, that we will require to make changes to this once we have not just the final directive, because it's not yet absolutely finalised, but also because it gives a lot of policy choices to member states. We might not know the final form of that in terms of implications for our own law until we've completed our own consultation processes. So one of the reasons the bill takes enabling powers is to allow that flexibility to make any changes that might be required. So there is still a degree of uncertainty flowing from the discussions around the directive, but we are, based on the state those discussions have got to thus far, we are fairly confident that the bill as introduced is consistent with EU law and that it's sufficiently flexible to allow us to ensure that it remains consistent as the final shape of the new directive becomes clearer.
Finally, from me is just, there's been a suggestion from some witnesses that the procurement reform bill could be used to strengthen FOI legislation, in particular including provisions to cover the contractors who win public contracts. I wonder if you're able to give the government's view on that.
Well, I mean, the bill does do a certain amount to promote transparency around the whole procurement process. But I take the view, and I'm obviously responsible for FOI legislation as well. I've just been at another committee talking about an FOI order. The FOI legislation itself contains the mechanism to extend coverage of the FOI regime, and I think it's appropriate that we use that to make any necessary extensions rather than trying to use the procurement reform bill or any other bill to do that. We've just seen the first order recently go through Parliament, and it will come into force in April to extend coverage of FOI legislation. So I think if there's a case to be made for further extension, whether it's to contracting authorities, companies contracting with public authorities, then the way to do that is through the provisions of the FOI legislation. I think to try to do it through the procurement reform bill would be a kind of inappropriate and clumsy way to try to do something that a mechanism exists for elsewhere.
Okay.
But I think when the bill team themselves were in, I brought this up about FOI legislation perhaps being there so that it can be used in section 29 rather than having different wording.
I think this is a slightly different issue. I mean, this is an issue the Commissioner has raised about, and now, as I understand it, I'm hopefully not putting words in the Commissioner's mouth, but I've seen the letter the Commissioner wrote to the committee, and the Commissioner, as I understand it, is not objecting to, I think it's sections 28 and 29 of the bill. It's just simply saying that some of the drafting of those sections could be closer in line with relevant provisions of FOI legislation. These have been drafted in the bill to be consistent with kind of European law, but we're happy to discuss with the Commissioner her concerns, and if there's amendments we can make at the next stage of the bill to allay those concerns or address those concerns, we'd be happy to consider that. But it's a slightly separate issue to the issue I think Mark Griffin was raising about whether we could use this bill to extend coverage of FOI, which is the answer I gave to Mark.
Thanks. Can I ask, how does the government respond to the view raised in evidence that unsustainable procurement, and I quote, currently Scotland is significantly behind Wales and a long way behind best practice EU countries, particularly Sweden, because it has lacked the political priority to get policy details right? Is the Cabinet Secretary content that the bill is in tune with the kind of innovation on sustainable procurement in other countries? For example, what is being taken forward in Wales and elsewhere in Europe. And I think I remember the previous Chief Scientist, Anne Glover, saying that innovation should be at the heart of a procurement bill.
Let me just make a couple of kind of contextual points there, and now I'll sort of try to address the question directly. Firstly, this is a priority for the government. We have spent a great deal of time, both my predecessor Alec Neil in this job, and since I took on responsibility, have rightly spent an awful lot of time not just developing this bill and getting the policy detail of this bill right, but on the wider procurement reform agenda. So whatever people think about years gone by and whether we gave this enough priority, I'm absolutely convinced and confident that we give it a lot of priority now. Second kind of general point is we'll always look to learn from other countries. I'm not convinced that the observation that we are behind other countries is correct, and I'll come on to say a bit more about that in a second. But thirdly, innovation is at the heart of this bill. If you look at the sustainable procurement duty at section 9 of the bill, the duty that's placed on contracting authorities there before they carry out a regulated procurement to consider certain things in the conduct of the procurement process. That's about how they improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of their area, how they facilitate the involvement of small businesses, third sector supported businesses, and thirdly, and expressly, how they promote innovation. And that, I think, is right, because one of the many things I've heard since I've been doing this job about some of the things that do need to improve are around innovation. How do we have a more dynamic approach to innovation embedded into the procurement process? And I think this bill helps us to do that. In terms of, just coming back to your point about where Scotland sits in terms of what I would describe as the international league tables of getting it right on procurement, I'm not saying we don't have room for improvement. That's why we're considering this bill. I'm not saying we shouldn't continue to look at best practice elsewhere and try to learn from that. I take the view across a whole range of things that we should never rest on our laurels. But I think if you look particularly at other parts of the UK just now, there's a lot that should make us think that actually we have been in certain respects leading the way. I mean, I know that the Welsh Government just earlier this year awarded its contract for its advertising portal to the same Scottish company, Aberdeen-based company, in fact, that's been providing Scotland's portal since 2008. So, we're ahead there. John McClelland did the report on procurement in Scotland in 2006. The Welsh Government got John McClelland to do a report on procurement for Wales in 2012. The European Commission has published a number of studies on procurement in the EU, and I think these studies show that Scotland is in many respects in the vanguard of developing good practice. So I think we've got a lot that we should be quite proud of in terms of what we're doing, but absolutely, I'm not sitting here saying it's all rosy and we shouldn't both be trying to improve on our own terms, but also looking at where we can learn from best practice elsewhere, and there's a commitment to doing that.
But I just wonder if there's an inherent contradiction in the way that tenders are drawn up vis-à-vis innovation, because if you're too specific, then you might be hindering innovation. I mean, and this is in the third sector as well as, traditional contracts that we think of, like building the fourth replacement crossing. Third sector organisations will say that they have innovative ways of delivering social care, for example. But often the contracting authority is very specific in the type of care that they want. So in order to avoid a situation where unsuccessful bidders will not challenge the awarding of the contract, how do you balance that? How do you see this panning out?
I think the first general comment I would make there is one of the things I've learned, and learned very early when I took over responsibility for procurement, is that there's all sorts of tensions running through this agenda, which is why getting this bill right involves balancing a whole range of kind of competing, not so much competing interests, but competing objectives. So that is a kind of given in this whole agenda. In terms of your point about innovation, I mean, I think it is really important that we try to build innovation much more into the whole process of procurement. I think the bill helps to do that in two important ways. The first one is the one I spoke about in terms of the sustainable procurement duty. Actually placing a duty on contracting authorities before they carry out a procurement exercise to consider how they're going to promote innovation is an important step forward. And so I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that. The second important change this bill makes is around procurement strategies. The procurement strategies that certain procuring authorities will require to develop puts an obligation on them to consider how they will carry out procurement, how they will go about procurement processes, and crucially, how they will engage with organisations, stakeholders that have an interest in the procurement. So again, that's about building in that proactive obligation to think about innovation, so that, obviously there are rules that kick in once the procurement is underway, but it's about how you think about procurement in a much more dynamic and less static sense, because you're absolutely right in what you say about, the contracting authority has one idea of what it wants. Those bidding might have an idea about how they can deliver that better, and we need to find ways, as the bill is trying to do, to make sure that dynamism doesn't get lost in what can become quite a static process.
Thanks. Mary.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to continue on the theme of the third sector and SMEs. SMEs in the third sector are a very important part of the whole procurement process. Are you confident that there is enough in the bill around a package of measures that's there to encourage their involvement and make it easier for them to be involved in the procurement process?
Yes, I do think that there's a lot in this bill that will do that. I mean, a comment that you'll hear me make frequently in relation to this bill is that it's not the be-all and end-all of our approach to procurement reform. If we think we're going to solve all of the issues in procurement through legislation alone, then we're kidding ourselves on. But nevertheless, what is in here is really important. So if I look at things like the transparency, provisions on transparency through contract registers, contract notices, published strategies, all of these are designed to make it easier for businesses to plan and to find contract opportunities a lot more easily than they can do just now. There's also the provisions around standardising aspects of the pre-qualification questionnaire process and preventing, one of the things you often hear from small businesses is certain selection procedures that are setting unreasonable entry requirements to procurement exercises. So the bill helps to deal with some of that. The focus on community benefits that is in the bill will also help third sector bodies, even if on some occasions their involvement will be as a subcontractor or part of a consortium. There's also the sustainable procurement duty in section 9, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, which puts the obligation on contracting authorities to consider how they involve SMEs, third sector organisations, supported businesses in procurement exercises. So all of that I think is important. All of that I think will have an impact and make a difference to the ability of small businesses to access procurement spend, which is very important to them. It's very important to the economy as a whole. Just getting more contracts onto Public Contracts Scotland will be important in terms of making sure businesses are aware of the opportunities that are there.
We heard from supported businesses in evidence that they often can't compete on cost, and that's one of the biggest barriers for them. to get involved in the procurement process. Again, are you confident that there is enough in the bill to make it easier, particularly for supported businesses, to be able to compete?
Supported businesses obviously are in a slightly kind of different position to other businesses here, and I think it's right that we, and I think I'm right in saying supported businesses is one of the areas of the new EU directive that may change even further in kind of widening the definition of supported business. I think, my answer to that question would go back to comments I made earlier on about, the value for money triangle. Cost is, we live in an environment where cost is important, of course it is, but in public contracting it should never be the only factor. We've got to look at quality and sustainability, and very often small and medium-sized businesses will be in a very good position on these other aspects of value for money. But the bill is fundamentally, I suppose, if it's about anything in relation to SMEs, it's about trying to level the playing field and open up the whole contracting environment for them much more than it is at the moment. Obviously, all within the duty of non-discrimination, which is an important obligation in terms of European and domestic law.
Okay, thanks. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has said that in their experience, public sector procurement teams are cautious in their approach to introducing contractual clauses or social targets for equality because of concerns of breaching European law. How do you think this could be avoided in relation to this bill?
There is some ongoing work being done around this. We, in partnership with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, we recently produced some guidance which is designed to assist public bodies in meeting their obligations in respect of the Equality Act. I don't know if the committee's had sight of that guidance, but I'm happy to make it available to the committee. And that's designed to help deal with the concerns that have been expressed around here. So it's ongoing. We're talking to the Equality and Human Rights Commission about how we best address that, so that public bodies can be consistent with their obligations under procurement legislation, but also their equality obligations under equality legislation as well. But I'm happy to make that guidance available to the committee, and if you've got any specific questions on it, we can come back to you on that.
Thank you. Are there any intentions to further break down the definition of small and medium enterprises to allow assistance for micro businesses whose needs are very different to SMEs, but quite often it's the micro businesses that can bring the greatest community benefit?
The definition of SME in the bill is a business with less than 250 employees, which I think is the standard definition of SME. It's open to members to suggest amendments that would break that down further, but that's the definition in the bill at the moment. I think what is important, regardless of what the definition in the bill is that we try to gather data that breaks down further to the level of micro business. We've got some data through public contracts, contracts advertised in Public Contracts Scotland. So, if you look at the businesses winning contracts in the last calendar year, 82% were registered as SMEs, and we also know from the Procurement Information Hub that in 2011-12, at least 6% of public procurement spending was directly with micro businesses. So we've got some information there about the breakdown of spend, and I think it's important that we try to improve on that and gather that. Slightly separate to changing the definition or breaking down the definition further in the bill, but nevertheless important.
Okay, thank you. What effect do you think the bill will have on framework arrangements?
The bill applies at the point that the framework agreement is established, just as it would apply to any contract at that point. What it doesn't apply to is the point at which orders are placed under the framework, and that mirrors the EU procurement directive. The rules there don't apply to orders under frameworks that are awarded under European procurement rules, so it applies at the point the framework is agreed, but not to the call-off contracts in terms of the framework.
And just finally, there is guidance in relation to the bill on blacklisting. Are you content that that's sufficient to address the concerns that have been raised around blacklisting?
I think in terms of procurement, the bill does allow us to go a significant way in terms of blacklisting. I should say, and I know this is something that will be shared across the committee, that we have nothing but contempt and disdain for the practice of blacklisting. We are opposed to it as a government in any form. What we do through the bill is take enabling powers, which will allow us to make regulations regarding how a company's suitability to bid is assessed. That's in addition to the guidance that the First Minister launched a couple of weeks ago, and we've also said we're committed to ongoing dialogue with the trade unions about that guidance to make sure we're effectively tackling this issue. So the regulations that would give further detail on the reasons by which a public authority would either be required to or may exclude a company from bidding would allow us to directly deal with the issue of blacklisting.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Convener. Just a short supplementary on blacklisting. Just to be clear, Cabinet Secretary, are you saying, when we heard evidence from the trade unions last week, there was a strong suggestion from the Unite union that the guidance, welcome as it was, and the ongoing dialogue that you've referred to with the trade unions, welcome though that was, only went part of the way, and that they would have preferred to see this put on a statutory footing? Are you saying that the regulations that come forward will fulfil that requirement?
Regulations are statute, but they're legislation in the sense that they're secondary legislation, given anchorage in primary legislation through this bill. I do think the issue around statutory force is dealt with in terms of the way we're trying to do this. I make the point about...
There's nothing... You've gone as far as it's possible to go, is what you're saying.
In terms of this bill, that would be my view, but we're at stage 1 of the bill, so I'm obviously going to listen to any expressions to the contrary that might arise as we go through it. I think the point about ongoing dialogue with the trade unions is important, because we want to continue to talk to them to make absolutely clear that anything that we can do to banish blacklisting is done. This bill and the regulations that could be made under this bill would make it possible for a company where there was evidence that they had been engaged in the practice of blacklisting and hadn't taken appropriate remedial action to put their house in order could be excluded from public contracts.
Thank you.
If you want to add anything on that.
No, that covers everything. Thank you.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah, Cabinet Secretary, are you able to outline the Government's plans for guidance on other workforce-related issues, specifically around inappropriate use of zero-hour contracts and also the living wage?
Obviously the bill talks about issuing guidance around, as you say, workforce-related issues. On the issue of the living wage, specifically at this stage, we are a living wage supporting government. We pay all our own employees the living wage. We encourage others to do the same. We've recently I announced that we're funding the Poverty Alliance to promote the living wage, or look at a project to promote the living wage in the private sector. So we're absolutely committed to the living wage. And this was my predecessor, Alec Neil, did this. We have examined this issue very carefully in the context of the procurement legislation. We wrote to the Commission, and it's been made very clear to us that making payment of the living wage a mandatory requirement for people bidding for public contracts would be in breach of EU obligations. That's a position we've arrived at reluctantly and regrettably, but nevertheless it's a pretty clear-cut position in our view of the European legal position. That said, although we can't make payment of the living wage a mandatory requirement, it is important to use this legislation to the best of our ability to encourage good practice by employers. So we've looked at how we can enable workforce-related issues to be taken into account in the procurement process, and what the bill has settled on is that the government should have the power to issue statutory guidance on workforce matters in procurement, and that would include remuneration. So we can't make it a requirement in contracts, but we can, through this bill, encourage good practice. And while I've been talking about the living wage, that would also apply to companies that were inappropriately using zero-hour contracts in a way that would impact on their ability to provide a quality service.
Do you want to come in on this?
This was another area in terms of outcomes for people in receipt of social care, residential settings, etc., and that was raised by the Health and Sport Committee. Do you accept, Cabinet Secretary, that the procurement process, intended or otherwise, has driven down the wages and conditions in this sector?
I'm not sure I totally accept that. I think there's a debate to be had in there about terms and conditions in the sector as a whole and the impact on quality, and I'm not shying away from that at all. I think, I'm not saying you're trying to oversimplify it, I think it might just be an oversimplification to lay that all at the door of the procurement process. I think what this bill is trying to do, though, is to make it very clear that issues on terms and conditions in any company bidding for public contract, where that is relevant to the delivery of the contract, is absolutely something that should be taken into account. And you know, the guidance that we will be able to issue under this bill will require purchasers to consider where it's relevant to the performance of the contract. And I think in the kind of contracts that you're talking about would be very relevant to the performance of the contract, whether that is evidence of inappropriate use of 0 hours contracts or poor levels of staff pay, might affect the bidder's ability to provide the required quality of service. So this, I think, takes us a substantial step forward in making it absolutely explicit that these kind of things, you know, where it is of relevance, which, as I say, in the kind of contracts you're talking about, it's hard to argue that it is of relevance, are absolutely material factors that should be taken into account.
It would be interesting to know what work you've done, Mr McNulty's done on this. I mean, have you looked at this issue in detail? That the facts and figures do not represent my and others' perception that we are outsourcing to reduce liability in the living wage in the local authorities, and those people who work in the care sector are on the minimum wage, and there's great savings there. What sort of work has been done into it? If we don't accept that the procurement process has not driven down these wages and conditions that we've heard in evidence.
I should say at the outset that the Scottish Government doesn't typically contract for social care. These are contracts usually placed by principally local government, but also the NHS. We haven't conducted specific studies of what's happening in that sector, but what we have done is work with stakeholders, including the Scottish Government's Joint Improvement Team and representatives of the sector, to develop very, very comprehensive guidance on the commissioning of social care contracts. That guidance makes it absolutely clear that the focus should be on quality. Clearly, you cannot ignore cost completely for any form of public contracting, but the guidance is absolutely crystal clear that there should always be engagement with service users in planning the procurement, and that there should always be a very strong emphasis on quality. And you know, nothing the Scottish Government has done on procurement would, in my view, encourage public bodies to pursue cost at the expense of quality in this sector.
When I put the question to Cabinet Secretary, did she accept the premise that the procurement process had driven that down? The Cabinet Secretary said, no, she didn't accept that. You were nodding your head vigorously. Where is the proof that that's wrong? You know, if the Cabinet Secretary says no, that's not correct, Mr McNeill, then surely to goodness we need to establish that clearly.
For the record,
I think we're getting away from the bill. I think you're trying to put into the bill things that are not in the bill. You know, what you're talking about is local authority, and as Mr McNulty said, health board procurement.
I also think, with respect, Duncan, you're trying to put words into my mouth. I said there was a more complicated discussion around that. I actually wasn't getting into a kind of argument with you about the premise of your concerns. I was just saying I think there was a danger we oversimplified it in terms of the procurement process. But right through this, I've been accepting and seeking to respond to the concerns that you've been raising. The point we've made consistently, and it applies to social care contracts specifically, but it applies more generally across this bill, and it's the point Paul was absolutely rightly making, is that as government, and remember, we don't procure these contracts as government, we have made clear through guidance our expectation of the standards that apply here. The issue that has led us, to go back to Mark Griffin's question, the issue that has led us to legislation here, not just on this issue, but in a range of issues, is our concern that guidance has not always been followed, which is why we're trying to give statutory underpinning to that guidance for the future.
One last question.
Mark Kine first.
Thanks, Convener. Back to the point on the living wage, I think most members of the committee share the government's frustration that it's not been able to be included here. A number of witnesses have said that the question the government's approach to the EU around the issue of the living wage, and rather than writing to the EU to ask if they could include it in the procurement reform bill, if you'd written to the EU to ask how they include it, that possibly a different answer could have been given. Are you confident that you have exhausted every possible avenue and measure with the EU to try and include the living wage within this bill?
I'm confident of the position I've outlined. I assume the committee has already had sight of the letter from the relevant European Commission. I'm happy to provide that again, which sets out, and the issue around European law is not in terms of the procurement directive, it's in terms of the posted worker directive. But I'm happy to make that available again so that the committee can see the reasoning of the Commission on this. I should say, though, I don't think it's a fair characterisation to say we've just kind of sat back and said the European Union says no, so we're not going to try and do anything. The provision that we've put in the bill is us trying to find ways of ensuring that where it's relevant to the performance of a contract, issues like how much a company pays its staff or whether they inappropriately use 0 hours contracts are things that can be taken into account by a contracting authority. And while I accept that there are people who would like to see us go further in this bill, and I'm explaining why we can't do that, let's not in that debate lose sight of the fact that this bill does take us quite a significant step forward, and this guidance will allow public authorities, as I say, I keep saying where it's relevant to the contract, to have regard to things like how much companies pay their staff, and I think that's a really important development.
Has there been any evidence so far that even just the talking about it that's been going on recently has made more companies aware of the desire of the government and others to pay the living wage?
I don't think we've got any systematic evidence of that, but I don't. In my experience, I think there's not a lot of doubt that says there is a much greater awareness about the living wage and the reasons the living wage is important, and I think that is the case in the private sector as well as in the public sector. I recently attended SSE's event where they became a living wage employer. I think the biggest company in Scotland have done so. I think there's a lot of work to be done in the private sector, which is why we are funding the Poverty Alliance to try to lead that work to look at a living wage accreditation scheme. So I think provisions like this in the procurement bill are part of that process of raising the awareness of the importance of the living wage and encouraging employers to pay the living wage. So again, I totally accept that there are organisations, including organisations that I've got a huge amount of respect for and agree with on a load of things, including the living wage, that they would like to see the bill make the payment of a living wage mandatory. But let's not lose sight of the fact that through the guidance route that we've opted to take here, we are able to take action that I think will have an impact.
Okay, if we move on then to Alex.
Thank you very much, Convener. Moving on to part 1 of the bill specifically, could I start by asking the Cabinet Secretary if she's content that the bill applies to the right set of contracting authorities?
Just Riley smiling there when we'd been at it for an hour and we're moving on to part 1 of the bill. Yes is my short answer to that. I'm sure the committee is aware of this because you've read all the accompanying documents to the bill, but our approach here is to mirror the application of the 2012 Public Contract Scotland regulations and while limiting the application to Scottish public bodies. 2012 regulations and the application of them is fairly well understood. It's long-standing. It appeared to us to be the simplest and most common-sense approach. The issue that's been raised in this area is around Scottish Water in particular. the regulations that we have sought to mirror in the bill don't apply to utilities. The reason they don't apply to utilities is because utilities are subject to separate European procurement legislation. There's a different EU regime than that for the public sector. And I think that is at least partly in recognition of the fact that most utility entities are subject to commercial pressures to some extent. So that's the reasoning for the list of contracting authorities that are included in this.
On that specific subject, the government, your predecessor in particular, made great play of the fact that this government was keeping Scottish Water in the public sector. And many of the utility companies you're talking about, of course, exist in the private sector. Is it therefore not a bit unfair to have a situation where we're talking about public procurement, but one of the biggest procurement authorities, procuring authorities in Scotland, which has been deliberately kept within the public sector by government, is exempt?
I mean, I can see the argument that people are making there, and I'm pretty sure this is a debate we'll have in subsequent stages of the bill. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. I should say that Scottish Water is in public hands, and as long as we get into do with it, it will remain in public hands. The issue, though, is notwithstanding that, it is subject to a separate EU legal regime from other public bodies, because it is subject to the regime in place for utilities. And we have taken a decision here. The decision in terms of what contracting authorities to include here hasn't been driven by a consideration of Scottish Water. It's been driven by a consideration of trying to keep consistency between the EU directive and the 2012 regulations and this bill, because to do otherwise may lead to, bring, for example, Scottish Water into the ambit of this bill for contracts below the thresholds in this bill, but they still wouldn't be subject to the regulations in terms of higher value contracts. So it's about consistency that happens to affect Scottish Water as opposed to any deliberate attempt to keep Scottish Water out of the ambit of this bill. So that's the reasoning for it. I'm pretty sure we'll have this debate as the bill progresses through Parliament, and we'll see where Parliament ends up on it.
Is there any scope for Scottish Water or any organisation which finds itself in a similar position to be brought within certain aspects of procurement procedure?
I would imagine that is possible in theory to do. I'm not sure that there would be an argument for bringing it into the ambit of parts of the bill and not other parts of the bill. It's something I'm happy to give more consideration to and reflect on and come back to you with a more considered response to that. Again, I'm just setting out the reasons why Scottish Water is not included. As I say, it's not really about Scottish Water as much as about trying to keep the regime being introduced by this bill consistent with the European regime. I hear the arguments on the other side of that. I don't necessarily agree with them, but I'm going to continue to listen to them, and we'll reach a view when we get to the final stage.
On a different subject in terms of application, we heard from a representative of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations about the possible cost implications the bill might have for housing associations. Do you have any response to that concern that was expressed to us?
I think, unlike the discussion we just had about Scottish Water, I think the first point to make about this is that housing associations are already within the scope of European procurement legislation, so they're already for, and the larger housing associations will, have to deal with that regularly. So, they're not having to kind of come from not being within the ambit of procurement legislation at all into it for the first time. So, they're going to be already complying with European rules, they're going to be complying with best practice in public procurement, and I think that really should limit any additional costs being imposed on them as a result of this bill. I think it would also be the case that experience shows that getting the right procurement skills in place tends to pay for itself very quickly. So I don't necessarily agree with the analysis that would be seeing substantial net additional costs for housing associations. It's also the case just to note that the requirement to publish a strategy will only apply to RSLs that award more than £5 million worth of contracts in any year, as it will only apply to any organisation that does that. So it's only the larger organisations that will be caught by that particular aspect of the bill.
Looking at the way the bill will be applied generally, would it be possible to apply certain provisions in the bill to main contractors in order to improve the situation for subcontractors?
I think in theory the answer to that question would undoubtedly be yes. It would be possible to do that. Whether it would be possible to do it without introducing a lot of complexity, given the very different types of contract that are dealt with and the different types of relationship that companies have, is another question altogether. One of the things the bill does do, as you'll know, in terms of the procurement strategy, is put an obligation on public authorities that have to deliver procurement strategies to set out how they intend to ensure that payments by a contractor to a subcontractor are paid promptly, and then payments by subcontractors to other subcontractors are also paid properly. So in terms of the procurement strategy, it does try to take account of the fact that obligations on contractors are often as important to people further down the supply chain as obligations on the main contracting authority. So that's the approach we've tried to take. I mean, again, it's one of these things I'm happy as the bill progresses to reflect further on and perhaps give more considered responses at later stages. I think trying to do what you're suggesting would add a degree of complexity to the bill that might be counterproductive.
We had suggestions from witnesses about things like project bank accounts, for example. Is that the kind of thing you're suggesting?
Absolutely, and we're already trialling, we're in a process of trialling project bank accounts. That was one of the early recommendations made by the construction procurement review, which I accepted, and we're getting ahead with that. So project bank accounts absolutely is the kind of things that a contracting authority in producing its procurement strategy may well look at in terms of making sure that payments right down the supply chain were made promptly.
Another thing we've heard from witnesses are suggestions that there should be better policing and better review of contracts once they're awarded. Do you have any view on whether the bill will contribute towards that?
The bill is not kind of expressly dealing, well, with one or two exceptions, the kind of post-contract award period. Contract monitoring should be a matter of sound procurement practice, and I don't think it's something that we should necessarily require legislation to do. I think that said, there are elements of this bill that will help with that. So contract registers, for example, putting an obligation on contracting authorities to publish registers that show who they're contracting with, and etc., will help to increase transparency and allow that monitoring to happen. I think the development procurement strategies will also help with that process. So I think the bill helps with that general environment, but it's not putting specific obligations on public authorities in terms of post-award contract monitoring.
One of the things I think I personally have asked just about every witness that's come before the committee is about the issue of threshold levels within the bill. And can I ask if the Cabinet, well, we've had various responses, it has to be said, but can I ask the Cabinet Secretary for her impression of how these thresholds have been received?
I think, at risk of being immediately contradicted by lots of people, I think they've been reasonably well received. It's the kind of thing where you're never going to get unanimity. I think getting unanimity on an issue like this would be virtually, if not absolutely, completely impossible. But generally, I think they've been well received. I mean, we wanted to have threshold levels that were simple. We took the 2012 regulations as the starting point. I should say European thresholds are expressed in euros originally, which are nice rounded euros. When they're then translated into sterling, they become less rounded and a bit more complicated. But we took them as our... Sorry?
Variable with exchange.
Well, and they are variable in terms of they are reviewed, I think, every 2 years. So we took them as the starting point. And not exactly, but we've come to a kind of position in this bill, both for services and works contracts, that is in the ballpark of 50% of the 2012 regulation thresholds. So you're never going to get unanimity around these things. To me, it feels, if you take the 50,000 threshold for services, goods and services, 50,000, below 50,000 is what we deem in Scotland to be a low value contract. So that seemed like the reasonable place to set that, and the works threshold, 2 million, is not exactly but roughly 50% of the 4.3 million, I think it is, in the 2012 regulations.
I was going to put a specific example of something that was raised to us, and that is that in relation to £50,000 contracts, if a £50,000 contract is issued over 4 years, that could take us down to 12,500 a year or thereabouts. And is it the intention of the government to have such small contracts covered by the bill?
I mean, that sounds quite small. I think I would reflect on the fact, or encourage members to reflect on the fact that £50,000 is actually higher than most thresholds, similar thresholds in other EU countries. I think the UK government right now is consulting on a £10,000 threshold. So, you know, 50,000 even broken down into those 4 yearly amounts would still be above that £10,000 threshold. So it's not as low comparatively as it might appear to be. All of that said, you know, we're going to keep this under review to see what the impact is and to make sure that we are responding to any real life concerns that arise when this bill is actually in force. And because of the ability that the bill gives us to amend the thresholds through regulation, we would be able to amend quite quickly if evidence arose that that was required.
Thank you.
Okay, Gordon.
Okay, thanks, Convener. We're moving on to part 2, covering general duties, etc. Civil society organisations have identified 10 priorities that they consider would make sustainable procurement be at the heart of the bill. How do you respond to these 10 priorities that cover a range of subjects from greenhouse gas emissions to promoting positive social outcomes? And how could these be built into the bill and associated guidance?
I think the first point to make is sustainability is at the heart of this bill. Most obviously through the sustainable procurement duty, but you know, I think in all aspects of the bill we've very much got sustainability in mind. I think if you look carefully at most of the 10 priorities that civil society organisations have put forward, most of them are addressed in one way or another in the bill. It might actually be helpful if we were to provide to the committee a note of each of these 10 priorities and explain how we think, if we think it is, then how we think it is addressed in the bill. I'm happy to get that done reasonably quickly for the committee. Clearly, we always have to have you know, our minds on what's possible in terms of the overarching European legal framework. We've got to look at what is feasible, what is affordable. We've got to, you know, make sure that we're keeping that balance of cost, value, sustainability. So these things are always, you know, I don't like the term balancing act, but there are balances that have to be struck in this bill, and there are tensions that have to be reconciled. But I think, you know, through those 10 priorities, we try to address them as much as possible. The guidance can expand on that, and you know, we'll no doubt have further discussions around some of them as the bill progresses. I remain open-minded to looking at how we can do that further and better. And once we've provided that note to the committee, then you can perhaps come back to us in terms of how you think we could reflect some of these better than we do.
You said that sustainability is at the heart of the bill, but the written evidence we had from the Faculty of Advocates has suggested that Section 9, which makes provision for a sustainable procurement duty, is in essence only a duty to consider. And they have suggested that this is unlikely to be effective in any meaningful, enforceable sense. What's your views on that?
Oh, I mean, I take a different view. I you know, take the view that if we place a duty on public authorities to consider these important aspects, and that's what they've got to do in terms of the law. And you know, for public authorities that are procuring over a certain value of contracts in a year, there's the added obligation to publish a procurement strategy and to publish an annual report on how they've done that. So I think that, you know, the obligations that public authorities are put under in this bill, I think, are quite significant. But one of the other balances we've got to strike is between putting sustainability in this way at the heart of procurement without putting undue burdens onto public authorities. So I think, by and large, we get it right. Like any piece of legislation, it is how it is implemented and adhered to in practice that will make the difference. I think civil society organisations will be a key part of the scrutiny process of how this bill works in practice. I chair, with the help of John McClelland, the Procurement Reform Board. It's going to take a very close interest in how this bill is implemented in practice as well, and all of that, I think, will act as a check on public authorities in the extent to which they're fulfilling their duties that are being put on them in this bill.
One of the 10 asks that civil society organisations have asked for is regarding tax dodging, and the Ethical Consumer Research Association has suggested the procurement bill is an excellent opportunity to take a lead on the issue of companies winning public sector contracts who use tax havens. Would it be possible to build in a fair tax accreditation scheme to be used by procurers as a means of rejecting products and services where there has potentially been abusive tax behaviour in the supply chain?
I'm happy to give consideration to that specific suggestion. I don't want to kind of respond without giving it adequate and proper consideration. I think the bill, though, through the sections around selection of tenderers and our power to issue regulations looking at the grounds on which a public authority might exclude a tenderer from bidding, would allow behaviour like tax avoidance to be absolutely taken into account, and that's certainly the intention here. So I think the bill is quite strong on that, but you've made a specific suggestion there that I want to give due consideration to, and I'm happy to do that.
Okay. The bill places a duty on contracting authorities to consider how they will promote and improve the economic, social, health and environmental well-being of the relevant area. Can you explain what is meant by relevant area?
It's defined in the bill, which I probably won't be able to find at this. Section 36, subsection 2, a contracting authority's area is the area by reference to which the contracting authority primarily exercises its functions, disregarding any areas outside Scotland. Basically, we chose relevant area in recognition of the fact that different public bodies will operate in different, a local authority is primarily concerned with its own area, a health board is primarily concerned with its own area, whereas, National Services Scotland, which procures for the whole country, is concerned with the whole country. So I think we need a degree of flexibility in that, in order to cater for the geographical differences of different public bodies. I think this does that. I'm not... I don't immediately understand the particular concern around that, but I'd be happy to consider it further.
So, how will public sector bodies demonstrate that they have promoted or improved their own relevant area?
Well, the responsibility on public authorities that have to produce annual reports on how they've implemented their procurement strategy will be the key way that happens. As I say, there will be, as a result of this bill, I'm sure, a lot of additional scrutiny on public authorities, not least from government-led bodies that will want to ensure that public authorities are adhering to this bill and that we're seeing the impact of this in their own area. So, I think there will be many ways in which we can try to monitor the impact of it.
And a number of organisations have made specific suggestions on how to strengthen the sustainable procurement duty. For example, Scottish Builders Federation raised concerns about the cost of the procurement process and asked for guidance to provide an indication of what would be considered proportionate. And I was just wondering how you could address some of these concerns.
Obviously, there will be a whole range of guidance that will be produced further to this bill. And, I said, I can't remember who asked me the question. I think it was Mark asked me the question earlier on about will we share draft guidance with the committee, which I've undertaken to do. There's going to be a requirement for guidance to give further guidance to public authorities and how they comply with the provisions of this bill. In terms of suggestions about adding criteria to the sustainable procurement duty or strengthening that duty, clearly, amendments will come forward in the course of the scrutiny of the bill, I'm sure, and we'll consider all of them. I think the key thing we have to try and bear in mind here is the right balance between sustainability and affordability. Also, anything that we put in place has to be legal, it has to be workable in practice for public authorities. It also, I think, is important to try to avoid undue duplication, which might just add to confusion and complexity here. So, the Climate Change Act, for example, already places public bodies under a number of duties regarding sustainability. It wouldn't necessarily be particularly helpful just to try to replicate that in this bill. So that's a short way of saying we will consider any additions or amendments that come forward, but we have to continue to try to strike all of these balances.
Do you think there's any conflict between balancing the sustainable procurement duty and the general duties contained in Section 8 of the bill? And how can a contracting authority be encouraged to use SMEs in the third sector without being accused of discrimination?
Well, firstly, the general duties that are contained in Section 8, I mean, one of those general duties in Section 8 is to comply with the sustainable procurement duty. So that kind of cross-reference is already there in the statute. I mean, as I said earlier on, there are always tensions running through this whole agenda that we have to try and reconcile as best as possible. Specifically in relation to SMEs, you know, the bill does increase opportunities for SME involvement, also for taking account of social and economic and environmental well-being into account. So, you know, puts the onus on public bodies to ensure that when it's taking decisions about procurement, they're not overlooking SMEs, they're not acting in a way that disproportionately provides barriers to SMEs from accessing procurement duties. So I think taken together, the package of measures in this bill will very positively impact on the whole procurement regime for SMEs. But as we've already spoken about, implementation and adherence and monitoring the impact of that in practice is going to be very important.
In answer to one of my earlier questions, you indicated the importance of annual reports. And I just wondered if you could elaborate on what kind of areas that the strategies would cover, and how do you stop it just simply becoming a tick box exercise?
I think in terms of the tick box exercise, you know, I think the scrutiny that will be applied around this from civil society organisations as well as from government will prevent it being a tick box exercise. It shouldn't be a tick box exercise. We want these things to be meaningful, which is why the bill, Section 11 of the bill, goes through some of the things that a contracting authority would have to take account of in its procurement strategy. So, you know, for example, how it will ensure that its procurements will contribute to the carrying out of its functions, deliver value for money, comply with its duties under Section 8, include things like its general approach to community benefits, how it consults and engages with people affected by procurements, and we've already touched on some of the things about how it ensures prompt payment right down the supply chain. So these are not necessarily exhaustive. We'll cover other areas in the guidance around this, but these are some of the things that we would have to take into account. I think in terms of annual reports, these are important, I think, and will be increasingly important in allowing us to monitor the impact of procurement strategies and the impact on a body's area and businesses within that area. So reports, Section 14 sets out some of the things that reports would have to report on, and the reports are going to provide a lot of the detail that then allows, for example, the Reform Board that I chair to scrutinise and monitor the impact in practice.
And just finally, a number of organisations that have suggested that the annual report could be strengthened and it would help organisations and SMEs if a timetable of associated activities and deadlines and what the potential spend would be in the coming year would be, so that they could actually build their business plans around potential procurement.
We could cover that in guidance, and again, that might be something that's quite sensible to. I think you'd have to be careful there. You're not kind of, you know, tying public authorities into, you know, sort of predicting too far in advance what they're going to. Although good forward planning is always something to be encouraged. So, yeah, I mean, at first hearing, that sounds like something we might be well advised to consider including, and so it's one of the things I'll take away and give further consideration to.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mark, did you want to come in before
thanks,
we move on?
Just before we finish on part 2, I just wanted to ask a quick question on Section 10, supported business. The STUC had submitted evidence to support a requirement for every public authority to have at least one contract with a supported business, although to be fair we did have conflicting evidence as to whether there was capacity in that sector to cover that. I just wondered what your views are around strengthening Section 10 on supported business.
I mean, I'm hugely supportive of trying to give as much support to, I'm using the word support here too often, supported businesses. The specific proposal you talk about was consulted on. It wasn't supported in the consultation, which is why it doesn't specifically appear in this bill. But I'm open-minded to amendments to Section 10 that would allow us to further strengthen the position of supported businesses. We've tried through the framework contract that's in place to raise the awareness of the importance of supported businesses and doing what we can within the procurement process to support them. So if there are specific suggestions, I'm happy to consider them.
Duncan, you were trying to catch my eye. Was your point covered? Or?
It's just on the sustainability. I think we've heard their language, not necessarily mine, in the third and independent sector, the drive and cost down, the rest at the bottom, the one size fits all. They say that's not sustainable. Do you believe that the 2010 guidance on procurement and for care and support it can be revised, and honed to take into these concerns, and indeed given greater legislative force would meet some of those concerns for the third and independent sectors and the delivery of care?
We'll always look at how we can address those concerns. I mean, what you described there in terms of a race to the bottom as not being sustainable, I would go further. I don't think it's acceptable. So, that's a point that I would want to very strongly put on the record. The guidance that we've referred to a few times, I think, is good, strong, robust guidance. I think the bigger concern we have is not so much that the guidance is defective, it's that the guidance is not being adhered to consistently enough. But, we are always open-minded to looking at revising guidance if there is evidence that the guidance is deficient and needs to be strengthened.
Do you think the guidance, actually does, brings about that process that actually evaluates the risk and the benefits and focuses on those outcomes that you want to achieve, that focuses on an improved outcomes for people in receipt of care?
In terms, I had obviously an involvement in this guidance when I was Health Secretary, sort of this guidance that lies in the health side of the government. The guidance is very strong in terms of the standards it expects and what it considers to be unacceptable. As we've said a number of times now, and I'm open to be persuaded that the contrary is the case. I don't have a fixed view on this, but my feeling is it's not the guidance that's the issue, it's making sure that guidance has been adhered to consistently by public authorities that are in the business of procuring social care contracts. So, I think we're in agreement about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. The question here is how we make sure those standards are applied and enforced and adhered to.
Are you confident that the bill does that?
Well, again, I think we're getting at cross purposes here about what this bill is doing and what. So I'm just being kind of cautious here about I don't make false claims for this procurement bill, but in trying to not make false claims for the procurement bill, that I equally don't sound as if I'm not acknowledging your concerns. I just think it's important we don't get at cross purposes about what we're talking about here and some of the wider debate about how we deal with the practices that you're talking about.
Okay, if we move on to specific duties, Jim.
Thank you, Convener. The bill places a number of duties on contracting authorities, one of which is that community benefit requirements should apply to all contracts above £4 million. Now, we heard in evidence to the committee from the STUC the view expressed that this could be strengthened so that this could be more of a binding requirement. So it should be a must rather than a should. So is that something you've considered in terms of reducing the wriggle room that would be available to contracting authorities?
I'm happy to consider that. I think in terms of the duties that we're placing, we're placing duties around community benefits on contracts over £4 million because the evidence is it's the bigger contracts where you can have most impact in terms of community benefits. I'm just looking at, I'm slightly hesitating here because I want to just look at the wording of the bill as it stands. Yeah, the contracting authority must, before carrying out the procurement, consider whether to impose community benefit requirements as part of the procurement. So there's a mandatory language there. Contracting authority must, in the contract notice relating to the procurement, include a summary of the community benefit requirements, or where it doesn't intend to include any such requirements, a statement of its reasons for not including any requirements. So I'm maybe missing something. I'm not entirely clear what bit it is that we're suggesting we should change from should to must, but I'm happy to consider it if...
Mr McNulty, did you want to come in on that? Or?
I think possibly the STUC were suggesting that we might kind of impose specific requirements across all types of contracts. Part of the problem with that is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, even for very, very similar contracts. You know, in a different area, there might be different community priorities, or different needs that the authority wants to meet. So there isn't one size that fits all. So we wouldn't support the suggestion of imposing particular requirements.
Okay. I was certainly just relaying the view expressed by the STUC. You said that you would consider that, so that's
community
fine.
Benefits. I mean, I think
the £4 million threshold, and be helpful to understand what the government's rationale and evidence base was for arriving at the £4 million figure. You said in your earlier comments that there's always a balance to be struck. So how do we arrive at the balance of £4 million? Why not £1 million or £6 million?
it mirrors, rounded to make it neater, the 2012 regulations on works contracts, which is set at, I think, 4.3 million in terms of the translation from euros into sterling. So that's the simple answer to why we've arrived at 4 million. I mean, there is I suppose a debate to be had about, you know, whether it should be 3 or 5 as opposed to 4. The reason it's in that ballpark goes back to what I said earlier on. The larger contracts lend themselves better to really meaningful, impactful community benefit clauses. I think the other thing to make clear here, and this is the area where I think we have to take great care, is that this bill is not saying that there shouldn't be community benefit clauses in contracts of less than 4 million. It is simply mandating in the way that is in the bill for contracts at or above that level. We should encourage appropriate community benefit clauses in all public contracts where that is proportionate and appropriate. So I guess if I was asked to say what we need to be very mindful of around the community benefit provisions of this bill, it's about sending a message that if you've got a contract less than 4 million, community benefit is of no relevance and you shouldn't even be thinking about it.
Can I ask you then, could community benefit requirements be determined on the basis of the nature of the contract rather than the value?
You could do that, but you might end up in a situation where you have less contracts covered if you do it that way than by putting a financial threshold on it. So, you know, there's arguments for and against all of the kind of approaches you could take to mandating a particular approach around community benefits. We've opted for a financial threshold. I've given you the reasons why we've opted for the particular financial threshold. I also want to stress, as I have done, that that doesn't mean contracts below that should not ever have community benefit clauses in them. There are different ways you could go with the nature of the contract. I know some witnesses also suggested that you could go for contracts that were a certain proportion of the overall budget of that particular public authority. I'm not convinced that would be a sensible way to do it. So there are different approaches you can take here. We've opted for this one. We think in balance it's the best one to take, but you know, I'm happy to consider alternatives as the bill goes through.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier the Climate Change Scotland Act. And of course, the bill provides ministers with the power to make regulations to ensure that a certain proportion of goods are procured by contracting authorities. That is a proportion of goods that are remanufactured or reused. Can you give us a bit more information on when the government would be expected to bring forward those regulations to provide the clarity that people would require?
And I think I'm not going to be absolutely definitive about that at the moment, because I think there's quite a lot of work that we need to do, and I would very much welcome the committee's ongoing input into that work. I think it's important that we make clear that the powers that we're proposing under Section 31, I think it is, of the bill, would be reserved for situations or for products where there's a clear and stable market, and, you know, a signal is required there to stimulate investor confidence. We're currently going through a process of examining products purchased right across the public sector to identify where it might be possible to pursue more sustainable alternatives, including products that have got a high recycled content, for example. We're also commissioning a series of market intelligence projects to examine the market readiness or the availability of remanufactured or refurbished products. So we're doing all of that work just now, and I think while this is a really important power to have in the bill, we need to make sure we use it properly and we do all of the work that leads up to that, and we discuss and liaise very closely with industry and the public sector. So we'll be continuing to do a lot of work on that, and as I say, I'd be happy to hear the committee's views and involve the committee in that work as we progress.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think before we move on to part 4, a short comfort break is in order. So if we take 4 minutes perhaps. Okay, if we can resume our questioning of the Cabinet Secretary, we move on to part 4 of the bill, which is remedies. Adam, you've got some questions on this.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. Now, Part 4 of the bill provides remedies for suppliers, similar to those in place for above EU threshold procurement at present. However, there was disagreement in the evidence as to how necessary these provisions are. For example, health boards stated that they could put off SMEs the hassles and costs of going to court, for example. And an ombudsman approach would be preferable. How would you respond to this critique, Cabinet Secretary, and what consideration has been given to the idea of a procurement ombudsman?
I'll come on to the ombudsman point in a second, because we have been giving some consideration to that. On the point about remedies and whether they'll put off SMEs, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that analysis. I mean, no organisation is compelled to pursue remedies through the courts, but I think it's important to have that option available for companies, and the remedies in the bill are available to all bidders regardless of size. So I'm not entirely sure that I agree with that. The bill tries to strike a balance between making the rules effective but not creating unnecessary risks. So it's the package of remedies in the bill is lighter touch than the remedies available through the courts in terms of the 2012 regulations. Give you a couple of examples of that. It doesn't provide for a standstill period between the decision to award a contract and its conclusion. It doesn't provide for automatic suspension of the decision to award if somebody challenges that decision, and it doesn't provide for the court to be able to declare a contract ineffective. It would only in those circumstances provide for the court to make damages payable if there was something flawed about the contract award. I think there's also quite important safeguards for public authorities, for purchasers in the procurement process in relation to the need for complaints to be brought fairly promptly. Normally that would be within 30 days of the complainant becoming aware there might be a problem. It also makes it clear that complaints can only be brought by somebody that wished to be awarded the contract, and only after they've made the grounds for the complaint known to the authority. So I think that hopefully strikes the right balance, but of course you're always going to have issues raised from either the purchaser or the supplier side about the appropriateness of that balance, but I think we've got it right. In terms of the Ombudsman, I know there's been quite a lot of opinion expressed in favour of an Ombudsman. I should say we have given some consideration to this, and although it's not provided for in this bill, it's not something we've ruled out entirely. What we intend to do at this stage is consider, again, the issue of an Ombudsman in the context of the 2012 regulations, because they will need to be replaced once the new EU directive is adopted in early 2014. There are other EU member states that have established procurement tribunals as part of their implementation of directive remedies. We've given effect to that through the 2012 regulations. So when we transpose the new directive into law, that gives us another opportunity to consider this question of an ombudsman, and obviously the evidence that's been given in the context of this bill would be taken into account when we're making that decision.
Space.
Indeed.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, one of the threads throughout all our evidence sessions, Cabinet Secretary, has been the need for skills and training both of procurement officers but also those tendering for contracts. In the evidence session on the 4th of December, the area of cultural change was dealt with or came up, and also in the memorandum that we've had from the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, they conclude that potential barriers mainly relate to culture around a regulated procurement activity. So what do you think can be done to improve skills and training both for those procuring goods and services but also those for tendering for contracts?
Well, firstly, I agree very, very strongly with the points that are made around skills and training and culture change. I mean, I've said repeatedly, and I'll no doubt say many times again, that this bill is only part of what we need to do to improve the whole procurement regime. Getting people to have the right mindset to procurement is an important part of that, and clearly linked to that is making sure that people have the right skills and capability. I know it's a point I've heard John McClelland make repeatedly, that we need to make sure that we have the right degree of professionalism about the whole procurement profession and the people who are procurement practitioners. There's a lot already happening around skills and training in procurement. So for example, we've got procurement capability assessments for organisations. There's a range of training tools in place for staff. There's a cross-sector capability assessment tool. We're also looking at different ways to encourage young people to enter the procurement profession through modern apprenticeships, for example. So there's a lot already happening in this area. I think as a result of this bill and some of the reform work we're doing, it's undoubtedly the case that more needs to be done. You'll have noticed in the financial memorandum there's some detail set out there about staff and non-staff resources that are intended to support training on both policy and systems changes for the wider public sector. So this is, in my view, one of the more important aspects of how we implement this legislation properly, is making sure that those out there, practitioners, actually have the capability and the skills and the training to do so.
Okay, thank you. Adam, you want to bring up some of the issues raised by the Finance Committee?
Yes, specifically about correspondence from the Finance Committee which indicated there's some uncertainty about Scottish Government staff costs beyond 2016-17. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I've seen the comments the Finance Committee have made here. It kind of goes back to the answer I've just given to the convener. There will undoubtedly be a need for additional staff resource during the implementation phase of this bill. That's going to be needed both to train on systems like the PCS system, to help deliver regulations and guidance, to help the public sector and businesses adapt to the changes. I think so that all of that is taken as read. I think what there is more of a question mark over at this stage is whether there will be an ongoing need for additional staff resource beyond 2016-17. I think that's something we're just going to have to review nearer the time, and that decision will undoubtedly be based on our experience and the amount of future work we still envisage having to be done at that stage. Personally, I think it's unlikely by that stage that we'll have ticked the box of procurement and said, job done. There'll be ongoing requirements, but I think we need to get closer to that point to assess what the ongoing staff resource requirements might be.
Other points in the Finance Committee will be picked up in the convener's questions.
Yeah, if I could just ask the question about in its memorandum, the Local Government Regeneration Committee raised the question about whether the bill is compatible with future planning partnerships legislation, and also how it relates to measures in the forthcoming community bill. But it also raises questions about the health and social care partnerships, when health boards are devolving pretty large percentages of their budgets to health and social care partnerships. And I suppose this is also an opportunity to bring in another issue raised with us in terms of the evidence we took out with the formal committee in terms of ALIOs not being covered by the legislation. So how do all these organisations fit into the procurement bill?
On the bill's consistency with or alignment with the Community Empowerment Bill or community planning partnerships, I think it is. One of the key provisions in the bill is around procurement strategies, and as part of the development of a procurement strategy, the public authority will have to look at how it engages with and consults with those directly affected by its procurement. That's clearly going to include community representatives, public service users, user groups. So I think there is a strong alignment between what the bill is trying to do in terms of engagement around procurement and the broader agenda of community empowerment. So that's a short answer to that, but I do think the two things are consistent there. In terms of the point about ALIOs, there is no real hard and fast position in the bill around ALIOs. Whether or not an ALIO is going to be subject to the provisions of the bill will depend on the individual status of the ALIO. If you've got an ALIO that is, to all intents and purposes, a public body, then it is likely to be covered. On the other hand, if you've got an ALIO that is a sort of institutionalised public-private partnership, then it may not be covered, but there's no hard and fast rule around that. I tend to think that's the right approach in terms of coverage, but it's an area where you know, I'm open-minded to suggestions that might come forward at later stages of the bill to how we clarify that or make that more definitive.
That would be helpful. Adam, back to you.
Okay, could I ask Cabinet Secretary, how will recommendations from the review of construction procurement be included in the bill and associated guidance?
I think the bill will be helpful in our ongoing work to implement the review of construction procurement. There's a lot of, as you will know, there's a lot of overlapping areas here. You know, simplification of the PQQ process being one of them. Prompt payment, I've already talked about project bank accounts and the work we're doing to trial project bank accounts. So the bill will help us to work out how best we use the levers in this bill to drive forward the recommendations for change that have been made by the thoroughly excellent report produced in terms of the procurement construction review.
Okay, and then Jim.
Thank you, Convener. I should declare at this point my interest, which is that I am the constituency member for the University of Edinburgh. And I wanted to ask you, Cabinet Secretary, you said earlier that one of the intentions of the bill was to create a more dynamic process for innovation, and that is primarily done through the sustainable procurement duty. But of course we received, it's fair to say, fairly hard-hitting evidence from the higher education sector about what they perceived to be the impact of the legislation as currently drafted. And the Advanced Procurement for Universities and Colleges said, and I quote, "The Procurement Reform Bill has a significant potential to damage the sector's activities around research excellence." Now, clearly that's not the intention, but the point was also made by Karen Bowman of the University of Edinburgh that that institution has spun out somewhere in the region of 170 companies. Now, they could be supplying the university, however, under the bill, their businesses will be open to competition. Now, in responding to those concerns, is it your intention to bring forward regulations that will exclude procurement for research purposes?
I mean, we've been talking to stakeholders about this, and obviously I'm aware of the concerns from the higher education and indeed further education sector about procurement law and the potential for procurement law to hinder their ability to compete for research and teaching commissions, and also just about the definition of research which the EU applies to certain EU exemptions in this area. So we've been discussing this with stakeholders, and yes, it is our intention to exempt from the requirement to advertise in the bill contracts which are in pursuit of commercial activities, which would include research and development. So similar to the indication I gave earlier on in connection with health and social care contracts, I would hope that that commitment will go some way, and hopefully a considerable way, to addressing the concerns that you've just cited.
That was a clarification that I was seeking, so thank you for that. And obviously there will be an ongoing dialogue with the sector to ensure that their concerns are taken on board. You mentioned the definition. I just wanted to ask you about that, and it may be that this is a question as much for officials as it is for you, Cabinet Secretary. Another point that was made in the oral evidence from the University of Edinburgh was that there is a challenge around determining what is research, what is teaching and what is administration, or a combination of these. And two examples were given, two practical examples. One was high-performance computing, which has a mixture of applications, and the other was the example of microscopes, which can be used in laboratories for both research and for teaching. So how is it intended to take that matter forward when it comes to defining what is research?
I always like questions from officials, so I'll pass it to an official.
I think there'll always be that sort of challenge where you're buying things for mixed purposes. It's a challenge purchasers face in other areas too. We would need to address that, I believe, in guidance that would need to focus on what the predominant purpose of the acquisition of the equipment was for. So if the predominant purpose was to use it for research, it would be exempt. If the predominant purpose was for administrative purposes, it would not be.
It's helpful. I'm sure the higher education sector will reflect on that response. Can I just ask you finally, what level of engagement has there been with the higher education sector?
I've personally had discussions with both Angus Warren, who's the Chief Executive of Advanced Procurement Universities and Colleges, and with Karen Bowman, who you mentioned earlier today. And I'm plan to continue that direct engagement and have committed to discussing the draft exemptions with both Angus and Karen as this progresses.
You see these issues being resolved through regulation rather than anything that would be on the face of the bill?
Well, I mean, it's not a matter for policy officials to determine. We're seeking advice from Parliamentary Council on what the most appropriate way to do that would be, and we're awaiting that advice.
Okay, does anyone else have any final questions that they want to ask, or has that covered everything? Any final comments, Cabinet Secretary? Okay.
Exhausted.
Well, can
exhausted me anyway.
Can I thank you very much, you and your officials, for answering the questions so succinctly. And at this point, can I suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to leave the room and to move into private as previously agreed by the committee?